Bismillahi walhamdulillahi wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah amma ba'd. In this session, we want to look at some values that govern counseling and objectives that govern counseling and the distinct nature of Islamic counseling or the philosophy behind counseling in Islam. Firstly, when we look at values that govern counseling, there's always the issue of belief that comes into the fore. So in this article that I'm reading from, it's entitled Counseling Values and Objectives, a comparison of Western and Islamic perspectives by Mumtaz Ja'fari. And it was published on iepistemology.net. He begins with talking about counseling values. And I'm not going to go into all the details because, of course, then it becomes a little tedious. But he says that values as regulators of conduct, things that guide our conduct, are types of beliefs. They are certainly part of one's ultimate belief system, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit. And so these values inform how we should or should not behave. That's one definition. Values are an inevitable and pervasive part of psychotherapy, for they determine the direction of the counseling process. The counselor influences the value system of the individual being counseled. Listen to this point. The counselor influences the value system of the individual being counseled in many explicit, meaning openly, and subtle ways, or explicit and implied ways. That's key to understand. And that should be enough by itself to demonstrate why it is that we need to develop this body of knowledge as a Muslim community in a way that will allow us to meet the goals that we want to achieve. There was the psychologist. He was actually murdered in Latin America. He was a Catholic priest. His name was Ignacio Martin Barro. He was a Jesuit priest, and he wrote a book called Toward Liberation Psychology. I had mentioned it before. And in that book, he talked about the nature of psychology being directed to particular communities. So we shouldn't assume that psychology overall is universal. The knowledge that is universal, because there's certain ideas that are there that are guided by a certain value system, right? And just like the author said, values end up guiding our behaviors or how ultimately we look at the world, I would add. So here, this is key. The counselor influences the value system of the individual being counseled in many explicit and implicit ways. And we find that is especially the case when you start seeing people go into counseling wherein they have marital problems. The counselor will, as for much the person claims to be objective and sensitive and informed and willing to deal with diversity, multicultural, whatever you want to say. At the end of the day, a set of values is going to come out to guide behavior. And sometimes those set of values will either wreck the relationship or build it up, or at least contribute to that reality. So remember that point. The counselor influences the value system of the individual being counseled in many explicit and implicit ways. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't avail ourselves of non-Muslim counseling. But what it does mean is that we have to have, for lack of a better term, an Islamic lens, or I would rather say the criteria of the deen, as far as the values of the deen, to judge if someone is involved in a polygamous relationship. Aside from the legality issues and whether you believe in polygamy as viable or not, Islam allows it. If that person that is involved in a polygamous relationship goes to counseling, and that counselor is giving guidance, advice, a listening ear, usually they try not to give advice. But if they're giving that listening ear with some judgment, there's going to be an issue in which, firstly, the issue of polygamy is a problem within that framework. Secondly, you're going to have a lack of understanding of those dynamics. It's already the case that in the reality of Muslim marriages, Muslims have certain values that guide their behavior. And so when they have marital problems, depending upon the counselor, a sister comes in with all black, or she comes in with hijab, or a brother comes in with the thobe or long beard, or a brother comes in and he is talking about his rights. He's talking about his rights. You're going to have a sense of judgment that's taking place there, just based on appearance by itself. That's natural. If that person is not extremely sensitive, that counselor is not extremely sensitive to how to operate and deal with Muslims and interact with Muslims, the first judgment becomes that of the hijab. Second judgment becomes that of the beard, or that of the thobe, or just the external appearance. That's the first. Then if the man is coming in demanding certain things like was alluded to, there's this concept of individual rights. The family doesn't come into play. Matter of fact, group counseling has its own problems. Counseling in the Western world usually revolves around the individual. It doesn't consider the individual and the society, or the marriage and the family. The whole is not considered. In generalities we're speaking, we know that there can be some approaches which are more suitable, but the concept in the Western world is to focus on the individual. It's not the focus, even legally speaking, that's the case. The focus is on the individual. There's no such thing as group rights or family rights. Even women in the West, in specific in the US, maybe in other places like Norway, they're more advanced. But for instance, for a woman to take maternity leave is until recent that is not punitive, meaning that it's not necessarily the case that she will lose her job just because she left work due to caring for the baby or to have the baby. All of that to say is that these counseling systems, we have to know their limitations as a community. We have to know how to benefit from them. We have to know that they will judge in certain ways points of religiosity, points of culture even, they will judge. And there's certain things that need to be judged, no doubt. There's certain realities that need to be dealt with. So the counselor influences the value system of the individual being counseled in many explicit and implicit ways. Research findings available on the impact of values indicates that the clients who improve the most during therapy are those who revise their values in the direction of those of the counselor, while the values of the unimproved clients become less like those of the therapist. And so this data is old, no doubt is old. If you look at the data, it's 1950s. But there's something to be said about that. Just because some data is old doesn't mean that it's unreliable, contrary to the popular opinion in Western academics. This happens. especially when you start talking about advice that's given mostly to women within the context of marriage issues. This happens. That the values of the person, they consider them as improving. So as long as that person is conforming to the values of the therapist, right? And that's why it's important for us to have more and more Muslims and systems, support systems that are being developed in this area. To have more and more Muslims going to this area and more systems that are created in this area, because after all, counseling came with a certain type of orientation, and that orientation that it came with was to fulfill certain objectives in the West, right? Counseling has been, now we're going to move to some objectives. Counseling has been developed. This is just to kind of open up this type of thinking in the community. There's more that can be done academically to deal with this issue. But in this case, we're just opening up the platform. So now he's talking about counseling objectives. Counseling has been developed in response to specific objectives in the West. It is worth examining to what extent these objectives match the Islamic perspectives, for they are not mutually exclusive. And I would say match the Islamic objectives and values. It's not just a matter of perspective. But we not going to nitpick. We understand where he's coming from. In Western language, that's how they speak, your perspective, my perspective, because there's no truth. There's no truth, right? There's only the issue of a good argument in that type of, in that framework. So as Muslims, we should be cautious in this regard. As Muslims, we should talk from the angle always affirming truth, right? So Islamic values, Islamic objectives, right? Things that are affirming the reality that we have revelation. Is not just your opinion and my opinion or a good argument, right? So counseling has been developed in response to specific objectives in the West. It is worth examining to what extent these objectives match the Islamic, he says perspectives, but we said here values and objectives. For they are not mutually exclusive. Indeed, one can even see a certain degree of overlap. Sometimes there's overlap. These have been advanced by some famous psychotherapists who are considered pioneers. These statements of objectives are expressions of definite paradigms developed or used by these pioneers. Brief definitions are given to provide an essence of the primary thrust of each of the paradigms. A short critique is also provided. So he's looking at Freud and To Love and to Work. This implies treating a patient for realistic recovery by restoring his or her ability and capacity for enjoyment and an active life. Freud explained enjoyment and life activity only through sexual behavior, which is interpreted as quite an inhibiting definition. That's his critique. So here, even though Freud is a little outdated, but still Freud has a major impact foundationally. Even those who say that Freud doesn't have an impact, that's questionable. That's questionable because there's certain givens in academics that they remain with consistency, although the form may change. Meaning, the same idea can be said by more than one person and is almost taken as a given in the science. So Freud laid down a lot of the foundations for their thinking. So here, the issue of pleasure and enjoyment became identified with sexual activity. So what does that tell you about the human being then? Right? There's no other dimension in that regard except the physical self in that aspect. So here that becomes the issue. What about if you're modest? Or what about, if you got involved in a polygamous type of relationship? Those things are all allowed in Islam. What about if you're having struggles with those issues? How would they deal with that? Those are the questions. Are the values that are going to come to judge the activities that people engage in? Are the values going to come by way of what Freud considers normal or abnormal, or by way of what the Quran and Sunnah allow, what the prophetic example gives as a a set of parameters. We can learn things from the social sciences, no doubt, because there are some things to be learned from the social sciences which sometimes are not spelled out in standard teachings, Islamic standard teachings, because they give a general outline. So this is not to negate the role, of these human sciences, but what it is to say is that we have to be careful what we're committing to, because they have a belief system. They have a belief system, a value system, and a certain understanding of who the human being is. And then the next system is self-actualization, where self-actualization is a little more better as a system overall. Self-actualization is seen as the most healthy, productive, integrated, and self-directing behavior, to actualize the self. Though the definition might be well encompassing, it fails to account for the vital spiritual aspect of behavior. Now, although Maslow in the hierarchy of needs, that's used, people like this, he quotes Maslow 6171. Maslow is used in child family services. That's how they train their workers. They use the hierarchy of needs, but there's developments that have been, there's been additions that have been added on to the hierarchy of needs. There's been a revamping of the hierarchy of needs, and the hierarchy of needs can be used in a few different ways, which there's some benefit to that system. That system is less violent than Freud. But here, what he's saying is that it fails to account for the vital spiritual aspect of behavior, right? And so here, and Freud's concept is about sexuality. Here is about really your material well-being, meaning that we're not looking at your soul's well-being. And so the other system is Bandura's system is self-efficacy, right? This paradigm is based on intentionality and stresses growth through the feeling of mastery over one's destiny. Since this concept is situation specific, there's no possibility that can be generalized, right? That is a little difficult to explain why it is that he came to that point. Mostly, if you notice, here in the idea of, and I mentioned this earlier, okay, Freud's system is about pleasure. Okay, sexual behavior, there should be some interaction with someone else if it's going to be healthy. So at least there's some inclusion in saying that, it's more than just me. But the problem with the system is that the pleasure principle comes back down to just mostly that type of activity in order for a sense of fulfillment. Where's the role of spirituality? Where's the role even of intellectual pleasure? And then the second one is self-actualization, which is about your development, right? And then self-efficacy is about your sense of mastery, right? So the thing that comes to be the case is that, okay, where's society? Where's society? Where's the community? Where's the family? Where's the ummah? That's what we talked about earlier. So the pleasure issue, is it just my pleasure? Or do I also take pleasure in seeing others take pleasure? Or is it just about me? Self-actualization, is it just about me? Self-efficacy, is it just about me? In the development theory by Moser and Sprinthull, this theory directs one towards grappling successfully with the tangible and intangible aspects of real life. If standards are ill-defined, these will render development out of context, meaning that you have some sort of standards that are there that are reachable, for your life. Some sort of also other values which are not materialistic, right? The problem is that what are those values? And that's kind of what he's coming out to. This is the point that he's trying, Dr. Jaffer is trying to bring to the table. He's saying, look, what are these standards? That becomes an issue. I have my set of standards for my own personal development. You have your own set of standards. In marriages, that comes up all the time. You have to negotiate that, especially when you talk about people's careers. So one person wants career development, the other person wants career development. They have outlined for themselves what they want for their own personal achievement. They may want to have changed their attitude, which is kind of an intangible, is an intangible aspect of the self that needs to be defined, or a standard that I'm going to have a positive self-determined attitude. Then maybe even they may get into physical development, and then they have this idea, well, you know what, in 2 years I want to increase my salary by 50,000, 100,000. At the end of the day, that may obligate me to move halfway across the world. Same thing when it comes to our youth. The whole issue that comes into play is careers are built around the concept of personal development alone. So what about the family? So now will my daughter leave the home, my son leave the home, never to return again? Or do they still, where's that commitment to the family, to the community, this and that? There's a lot of things that come into play in these type of theories when we start talking about what it means to develop for ourselves. If we have clear goals, those clear goals can be there, those standards can be there, but do they clash with others? That always is the question I'm going to bring to the table here. What's the role of others? What's the role of the family? What's the role of the community? What's the role of the ummah? And the issue that comes to the table is that when you start talking about the individual development, what does that mean for a marriage at the end of the day? That's why I was alluding to that example. If I want to increase my salary by 50,000 a year, 100,000 a year, and that requires me now to take a job in Southern California, and I'm all the way in Ohio, and now I'm choosing between my family, and this can be the wife or the husband. The husband is a little different though, in the sense that the husband, as has been normally the case, that the husband leaves the home. In some cases, when we talk about someone leaving the home, usually it's the husband that leaves the home to send money back to the family. But then when mom, she gets into that situation where she's thinking about leaving, or wifey, she thinks about leaving, what does that mean for the family? Do we hold her to the same standard that we hold, the husband? Is it allowable or not? And so these things, that's why I say our decisions, a lot of times, our decision process. I mean, this stuff makes and breaks people. Our decision process a lot of times is focused around the I. It's not focused around the we. And then sometimes when we talk about community, there's also the problem that is focused around the community without focusing around the I. And these issues were brought up in Islamic thought in the past. That communism eliminates the individual. And that's not always the case, but that's the general characterization. In Islam, that's a problem. The individual has to be there. And then capitalism as a system, and even somewhat democracy, eliminates the group. Not in every case, but the general tendency, because it's my right, my opinion that I exercise. So where's my opinion in regard to the general good? So those things, we always come back to that issue, right? And there's a few others that he's bringing up. One of the better ones is the one that was done by Martin Buber. Martin Buber was a Hasidic Jew, and he came from the Zionist movement, and he called it the I-thou relationship. The theory focuses on relationship enhancement in a family setting. It is heavily value-laden as it emphasizes what is right and wrong. Of course, that's going to be a little closer to where we're at because, Martin Buber was a religious Jew. And so he brought in his orientation into his theory. That in itself is a condemnation of the culture of imitation. What I mean by that is that a lot of us Muslims, we're content with imitating, not with generating. And so some people are committed to their value system. This is an article, Abu Anas. This is an article that's comparing. You asked what am I reading from? Is an article comparing Islamic counseling and Western counseling, but I tried to call it non-Islamic to get out of that everything that's Western is bad. But to this point of Buber, he believed in keeping committed to his system, and so then when he started to deal with generating a system of therapy, system of psychology, system of care for the self and for the community, he came in with his values. He didn't come in outside of his values, and the Muslims need to come in with their values. That's what's creating a problem for us, is that when we run into problems, we don't have anywhere to really turn. And so now look, there's a big difference when we start looking at some of the orientation in Islam. He says, while Western counseling aims at achieving individual well-being within the confines of this world, Islam defines well-being from an entirely different viewpoint. A Muslim is directed to seek this well-being as stated in the Quran. Our Lord, give us good in this world and good in the hereafter. This is the primary difference in the worldview of Muslims and non-Muslims. The concepts of well-being, satisfaction, salvation, self-realization, and achievement are linked with the belief that an individual's performance in this life determines the ultimate outcome in the hereafter. And also you see that, there's some dua made in the Quran on the lips of on the tongue of the prophets that, to make our children the apple of our eyes. And so there's a view of, that we, when we talk about taking pleasure in building the family. And if you start to look at other philosophies outside of Islam, you look at, for instance, something like Ubuntu that was used in South Africa as a concept. That, I am because we are, as a general philosophy. That part of me is part of you. That, when you start looking at that reality. Or you look at statements by the Mandinka tribe, that one of the biggest goals or one of the greatest goals for the man is to develop a family. And so that sense of individuality is being broken. There's this sense of building the community. So in any event, you begin to see some differences. So even if you use other philosophical systems, you can see where we are in the system. We are in the system, but Eurocentrism, or focus only on European thought, has created a situation in which they believe that the standard for everything, and we who follow that, no, I'm not saying we follow that exactly, but those of us who choose to follow that, we think that way is the standard. Remember some years back, Bismillah, I used to live with some Turkish brothers, and one of the things that I always loved is the communal spirit, And one of the brothers said, we've noticed that the longer that our brothers stay here, the more individualistic they become. They break from the Jama'ah. One time I was with some brothers from Syria, graduate students, and they by themselves mentioned the same thing. They said, when our brothers come from overseas, but they mentioned it in the other way. When our brothers come from overseas, they expect to call us up at any time. They expect that we're going to be there to visit at any time, to be with us, and they can't accept a no. And I remember one of the doctors, he says, that's how we are overseas. He says, but here I have my responsibilities with graduate school. I have my clinicals. I have this. I have that. I can't keep up with the relationship in the same way. That being the case, both of those communities, the Turkish community and the Syrian community, in this example that's being given, they came to a consciousness, those who were reflecting on what was happening, the changes, that by being here, the values were changing. And the values of community were giving way to the values of necessity, like in the case of the doctor, or in the case of just adapting, like in the case of all of them, really. That's they learn that this is how you function. You have to make moves on your own. So here he says one is that one of the first principles in the Islamic concept is that an individual is born with an innate innocence that needs to be preserved and enhanced. It is society's obligation to provide conducive conditionings for such upbringing. Here's the opposite. The environment that you live in can be the environment that destroys their very innocence by at an early age introducing our youth to certain realities. Right? And so the peer group comes in and begins to take more influence over the child, more influence than the family. What's going on with you guys? Go grab her. Come here, Yasira. Come here. So the second is that the material and spiritual well-being is achievable through a profound... Come here, Yasira. Material and spiritual well-being is achievable. Come here. But you have to stop crying. Stop crying. Shh. Come on. Material and spiritual well-being is achievable through a profound submission to the will of God. None of this was mentioned before in any of the theories. The issue of well-being on a material level, emotional level, spiritual level. Be quiet. You make too much noise. Those who fail to submit are in a state of conflict and their personalities begin to disintegrate. And this is something that we have to mention. We rarely mention this in the community. And lately I've began on a personal level to mention this, that we have to recognize that sin has an impact. When may Allah protect us, when we're sinning, even if the sin is on a personal level between ourselves and Allah, that's better than a sin that's between ourselves and the community and Allah, because then we bring corruption into the community. But regardless of whether it's a sin that is manifest or a sin that is hidden, sin has an impact. So that's going to impact ourselves, our attitude, our relationships is going to come out. It's like the food that you eat. The food that you eat, thank you. The food that you eat has a massive impact. And so this is something that we're never talking about, the reality of Iman and how it impacts. So here he's saying that our fulfillment, our development, from our understanding, our orientation as Muslims, is that our material and spiritual well-being is achievable by following the deen. May Allah grant us that reality. The other thing is that the individual has the ability to reason and the freedom of choice. One of the mashaykh in Egypt had brought this up when it came to the point of intimacy between people on a physical level, and he talked about, is it a need or not? And so some of the concepts that are there in Western thought is that it is just like food and water and everything else. And he had some contesting with that point. He contested the point. It's true, because for the general public, it is to a certain extent. But when you look at, for instance, like a Nawawi, here, go play. When you look at Imam al-Nawawi, or when you look at, like, for instance, Ibn Taymiyyah, these people, they didn't get married. And so there's a sign, and they didn't become perverse either. So there's a sign, they became completely devoted to the community. Completely devoted to the community. And so there's an indication that we can overcome our physical natures. But is it natural 100%? It's not. The sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam 100%. That's not to say that those ulama went against the sunnah, but the general pattern is for us to express ourselves in those ways. So the concept there is that the point of saying that is there are desires can be tamed, but it takes work. And that's why in Ramadan we fast, we control ourselves. That's why we ask to fast on Mondays and Thursdays, 3 white nights. That's why we're asked not to fill our bellies up. Only 1/3 of the belly should be full with food. There's certain things that are done in the deen as far as a practice to allow ourselves to have that sense of choice. And these systems of thought, we're just instinct many times. That's why now they're having a massive problem with how to deal with the issue of drug addiction. Is it a choice? Is it a disease? If it's a disease, you eliminate the free will. If it's a choice, then why the heck is the person undermining and destroying themselves? And there's no clear answer for them on that point. And so here, Islam is saying, it's through that commitment to the deen that we actualize, that we grow, that we find a sense of fulfillment. And I'm just summarizing some concepts. Islam requires a community that has a social function. So I love this piece here. Islam requires a community that has a social function, for it is not confined to the individual God relationship. And a lot of Muslims don't realize this is an issue in Aqidah. That they begin to say, it's between myself and Allah. Deen is between me and Allah, my heart. Not realizing that there's a commitment that we have to each other in our practice. May Allah forgive us for our deficiencies. We understand it's difficult to practice, but if we look at the standard practice of the deen, just look at the idea that if you don't see your brother in 3 days, that you reach out. Or if you don't see the brother in the salah line, the same thing is sisters looking out for each other and so on and so forth. And so our relationship to Allah in that sense is not confined just to ourselves, but is also confined into wishing well for each other. The deen al-nasiha, and that's the wishing well. And that means that there's a commitment between ourselves and each other. So our acts of ibadah in Islam, like salah, hajj, Ramadan, all of those are communal acts. Even zakat, they're communal acts. Right? There's salatul jama'ah and how much that's emphasized. That's just to give the example of that religion for us, if, for lack of a better term at the moment, we could say deen. But the reality is that it has a community component. It has a community component. So here he says Islam requires a community that has a social function, for it is not confined to the individual God relationship, but rather seeks to create a strong, healthy, and well-organized social life. With that, suicide decreases, depression decreases. With that, even crime decreases, because the neighbors, they begin to give a damn about each other. Sorry for using that language, but it's a reality. When you live in an environment in which the people don't care, then anything will happen. Just like, sometimes periodically, not to pick on New York, but we see scenarios that have taken place in New York where people will be robbed or injured or killed and nobody cares. And nobody cares. And it's known, is recorded, it's something that goes viral. We see that it happens, and we see that no one cares. We see that no one intervenes, no one cares. So there's no sense of this concept of the public space in which the good has to be emphasized, right? And the evil has to be de-emphasized. And really we have left that up to the police. We're not talking about vigilantism, but we're talking about if you have a concern for the community, for the society, you have a different type of society, right? It'll be a strong, healthy, and well-organized social life that we live. The fabric of social life is the doctrine that Muslim communal brotherhood and sisterhood, right? I'm adding that piece as a vehicle for social welfare, wider peace, and the attainment of harmony in social bonds. This system of social health must be maintained. When I finish. This system of social health must be maintained by establishing the institutions of advice, discipline, and welfare for the benefit of all. The concept of ummah, which he calls ummatic, the concept of ummah, he calls it. This ummatic concept is based on a system of social relations that seeks to maximize the enjoyment of good on earth within the divine plan. There may spring from you a community who will invite to goodness and enjoying good conduct and forbid indecency. Such are they who are successful. This is a trust bestowed upon Muslims that needs to be realized as one of the aims or objectives of the Sharia overall. In order to integrate the Muslim community, the institution of sincere advice is perceived as a fundamental obligation. You are the best ummah that has been raised up for mankind. You enjoyed right conduct and you forbid indecency and you believe in Allah. On the basis of these principles, the ultimate goal of Islamic counseling, and we come to a close with this, will be to develop an Islamic personality. But that personality is not a personality which is just focused on me and I, right? This personality needs to be healthy, balanced, and well integrated, and have all of its drives, emotions, and cognitive operations directed towards a pursuit for the pleasure of Allah. This type of personality is successful in overpowering the evil-prone self, the self that's encouraging you to sin. Deviant pathological behavior is corrected by an inducement of the reproaching self, meaning you're telling yourself, man, this is not the right thing to do. Like, what are you doing? This is wrong. That type, rather than being completely submitted to plotting in your head or in your mind or in your heart, doing something that's haram. The ultimate target is the attainment of absolute and constant contentment, which is possible through consonance of the human psyche with God, being in commune with Allah. This is the stage of the constant contentment of the psyche, that we are realizing our goals overall as Muslims. We shouldn't forget that. I remember I was reading a book of sociology, written by a rabbi. And I studied sociology. None of the theories that are used by people that are non-Jewish practicing are used. All of the concept about how society was understood in that book has something to do with their own teachings. And the unfortunate part is that the Muslim community, again, is not asserting itself in that way to understand itself by its own book, its own guidance, which is in the Sunnah, by its own teachings. We've approached a very dangerous stage in which we haven't developed our knowledge base enough to be able to deal with our needs, like the issue of counseling. When you look online and you do book searches, you're better off finding journal articles, bismillah. But you can't find much on Islamic counseling at all, period. Islamic conflict management, interpersonal conflict management. Mostly everything is based on war. You won't, and the English language, that counts too. Maybe there could be stuff in other languages, but here we're limiting it to the English. You won't find a lot. You won't find a lot of stuff that's done in a very systematic way of dealing with marital conflict in an Islamic sense, or the issue of the role of the community in counseling, or the role of the family. All that stuff now people are trying to publish on it, and most of them, are people that are, sometimes they're not grounded enough. But in any event, that's to say that we have to focus on these things. But definitely there's some differences in goals and values between Islamic counseling and the counseling system which is out there. But the unfortunate part is that we have not developed Islamic counseling to the level that we can completely dispense from using the systems that are out there. So we have to, up to this point, combine between the two, especially when there's mental health issues that require psychiatric evaluation. The best thing is that if there's someone counseling along with a psychiatrist, that's a Muslim. But for that person to be left on their own to psychiatry only, especially with non-Muslims, or even or psychology even, without any Islamic values, what we're doing is opening up the doors of destruction for our own people. Because there's things definitely that are not understood as far as what is my goal in life as a Muslim. That's not understood by the non-Muslim. What is the goal? What are the goals for my marriage? That's not understood by the non-Muslim. What's my goal in the community, in the society? Those things are not understood by the non-Muslim. So yeah, that we can get the support, but it's never going to be the guidance that we need in its entirety. And again, I'm not trying to be irresponsible here and say stop, visiting your counselor or your psychiatrist. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is inform yourself better as to who we are as Muslims, and what are our goals in life, and how it is that we can deal with our realities in a preventative way. If we're following Islam, then there's going to be a lot of prevention. If we don't follow Islam, we're going to run into a lot of problems, like the use of drugs, like engaging in zina, like watching pornography, like not taking care of your health. All those things lead to depression, anxiety. They lead to a lot of self-contradictions. They lead to other issues that come up, physical ailments. Just the consequence of that. But unfortunately, as a community, we're getting jammed up in these things, and we ask Allah Ta'ala to aid us, to help us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.